Alrighty, welcome in everyone to just another episode of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee, and it's prediction time. We're 12 days out from college football being in play, and frankly, I pushed this off about as long as I could because I'm very nervous about these predictions. There's a lot going on in college football. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of variability this upcoming year, maybe even more than last year. There's a lot to take into account. I'm going to start with the conference that I feel is the easiest. It was not all that easy to put this together. And we're going to start with the ACC today. We'll probably go Big 12, Big 10, and then finish off the week with SEC, but still kind of playing that out. We'll let y'all know throughout the week, but it's going to be all predictions all throughout the week this week. But we're going to go through major storylines to start the show. Make sure you guys know just what are the overarching things going into this ACC season. Then we have some groupings. I don't necessarily want to call them tiers because that's not exactly how I would rank these teams, but wanted to break it down into some different groups and some different things that I think some X Factor teams, some teams that are being led by transfer quarterbacks, some teams that are just battling to get to 6 wins. And we'll talk about all of that in the second segment. Then we'll jump into a little bit of players to watch. I always hate when we go to these big time previews for these big time conferences and we leave a team out entirely. I always hate when a Wake Forest is left out, or a Stanford, or someone like that who, yes, it might not be the greatest season for them, it might not have been the greatest seasons for them over the past couple of years, but always want to be able to include as many teams as possible. So we'll touch on every team, give you 2 players from every team to make yourself feel a little bit smarter if you're talking about college football throughout this year. And then we got superlatives and my championship pick. And it was really hard to put this one together. I think I had one team that I knew was going to be there. The rest of it was entirely up in the air as far as I'm concerned. But let's go ahead and jump in, and let's go ahead and start with the storylines. The storylines in this conference are far and wide. There's quite a few things to talk about with this conference, but I think the one that everyone is wondering the most aggressively and the one that everyone is watching for is, was Dabo right? And I think this is something that at this point you can pretty comfortably say yes. His approach to college football over the last 5 years has been very different than every other coach in the entire country. Didn't take a portal guy until, well, he took, I guess, Hunter Johnson 1 year, but he was already a Clemson player in the past. He took one this year, or 1 or 2 this year. Will Helt, I think, is going to be a great addition to this defense, be a real force off the edge on the other side of TJ Parker, so love the pickup there, but I think the question is, do they need to back their way into the CFP like they did a year ago, where they kind of needed a little bit of help down the stretch of the season, where with Miami losing a couple of games, they get into the ACC championship against SMU, they're able to win that game, and they're the last team in the field. They were the 12th seed in that one and got Texas in the first round, but the reality is, this would be the moment to step up. This would be the moment to take that next step that we talk about with Penn State all the time. Kind of the same thing with Clemson, at least over the last 5 years. Obviously, they have a title that is not in the too distant past, but at the end of the day, I think everyone's wondering, could this be a victory lap for Dabo Swinney? Could he just roll through this conference, get to the CFP, maybe be the number 1 team in the country, or do they hit a couple of bumps? And we're back asking the same conversation of, did he not do enough in the portal to add to the positions that he might need to add to? Now, I don't see a lot of positions he had to add to in this offseason, but definitely could reveal themselves throughout the year. I tend to believe that Dabo Swinney was right and I was wrong in a lot of this, but at the end of the day, we'll find out in 2025. Moving forward to the other team that everyone's watching, Miami's got to deliver this year. And I think this is a conversation that is a little bit complicated because you're losing Cam Ward. You're losing, I believe, your top 6 pass catchers from a year ago. You're losing some big-time players on the defensive side of the ball. But the reality is you have to be better. There's no 2 ways about that. You're in a conference that is absolutely wide open after Clemson. You're in a position where you are the most talented team in the conference on a paper standpoint, even including Clemson. You are a team that can do just about anything under the sun in the college football world this upcoming year. It comes down to Mario Cristobal. I think everyone understands that at this point. They lost certain games last year, that Georgia Tech game. They lost in part because of Mario Cristobal. They lost the 1 year before that almost entirely because of Mario Cristobal and a number of other things. But the reality is they're in a position where you got to make the CFP. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy for a team that's changing quarterbacks, that has so much different moving parts, but Miami's got to keep making steps forward, or Florida and Florida State are going to take advantage of the opening that you give them. That state of Florida is a very volatile situation, especially right now with all those teams kind of going in very different but kind of similar sort of directions. It's a very confusing time for those three teams down in Florida. Miami can't give up that perch. And I think right now they're probably sitting at number one in that state. I think Florida could pass them very easily. I think Florida State could pass them very easily if they're not careful this upcoming year and maybe fall short of even what they did last year. So it's a huge year for Miami, even with all the turnover, even with the quarterback change and everything going on. They got to be able to deliver this year. There's no doubt about that. And obviously, we got to go to Chapel Hill. Bill Belichick Watch will be something to behold throughout the year. They play TCU right away on that Monday night first week. It's going to be a really interesting game to watch, and especially to watch the reaction afterwards. I think there's going to be a lot of people saying UNC is going to be terrible if they lose. I think a lot of people are going to be saying this is a playoff team if they win, and frankly, they might just be a playoff team if they win that game. That has something to do with their schedule that we'll get into in the next segment here, but the reality is this is going to be one of the major stories, good or bad, in the conference. However this goes, it's going to be a lot about Bill Belichick. You can probably get used to hearing that name pretty consistently throughout this year. He is going to be all over the place for very good reason. It's going to be fascinating to watch this team go to work this upcoming year, a very manageable schedule. If they win that week one game against TCU, things get really interesting in a hurry for this Bill Belichick team and UNC, and I think it could be one of those teams that we look back on the season and we say, maybe that schedule sets up just nicely enough for them to make some noise. If it does, it's going to be a crazy media train around that team, and it'll be a really interesting thing to watch. One way or another, Bill Belichick's going to get a lot of talk this year. Could be good, could be not so good. Moving on to the quarterback situation in this conference, I find it to be a very weird situation. Now, every conference nowadays has a lot of different moving parts, with transfers coming in and transferring out, or new kids, freshmen starting, or transfer quarterbacks coming in, or just a guy that's waited his turn taking over for the offense. But in this conference alone, you have really known commodities like Cade Klubnik, Haynes King. You have a guy that's super talented that came over like Darian Mensah, a guy that has quite a big price tag on him in Darian Mensah that absolutely has to deliver. You have uniquely talented younger players like CJ Bailey over at NC State. I don't know how dangerous NC State's going to be this year, but it's a really talented kid that can do a lot of really incredible things. And then you add in Eli Holstein, you add in Carson Beck coming in from Georgia. There's a lot of interesting quarterbacks, and I think when you talk about the quarterback play in this conference, it's probably going to come down to the guys that just stay steady throughout the year. Whether that's Cade Klubnik or Haynes King or maybe a Miller Moss over at Louisville, it's going to come down to those guys at the end of the day. And I think it's about as weird of a landscape as you can have in the world of college football when it comes to the quarterback position, because there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of talent in this conference at that position. Is there enough comfortability in the offense for some of these players that they're going to be able to hit the ground running and really make a run at this conference? Then you got tons of CFP possible Cinderellas. I shouldn't say that they are absolutely going to be those teams, but whether you want to talk about Georgia Tech, everyone seems to be talking about Georgia Tech right about now. Louisville, Pitt, SMU, a little bit less so of a Cinderella given what happened last year, but still would be a very interesting story. Duke and a couple more teams, I think, have an ability to make a run at this thing. Now, it's going to be really hard to make it through the smoke. I think there's going to be a lot of teams right around each other, and we'll talk about that here in a second when we get into the groupings, that it's going to be really hard for people to separate. But someone's got to. At the very least, someone has to be that second team that joins Clemson, or maybe Clemson falls off just a little bit and they got two of these quote-unquote Cinderellas in Charlotte at the end of the year. The reality is, you look across this conference, there are enough teams to possibly get that second team in there. Maybe even get a third team if two of these teams can separate, whether you want to talk about Georgia Tech or Louisville or maybe even a Miami. I think that's less of a Cinderella because of their talent level, but it's still a team that hasn't made the CFP yet that very much wants to break through this year. So it'll be awesome to watch this unfold. I think when you look at the ACC, a lot of people have it Clemson and everyone else, including myself. We'll talk about that in a second, but the reality is there's a lot of Cinderellas here that can make some big-time noise and possibly be that second team in the ACC, or you could just see Clemson tear away from the pack and everyone else is left just kind of at 8-4, 9-3, just having a solid but not great season. And then this one. This is a very kind of interesting talking point going into the offseason and really will be going into every season going forward until there's another conference realignment. The reality of conferences nowadays is there's a pecking order. And whether or not you want to put the Big Ten or the SEC on top, it doesn't matter. They're pretty much working together up top, and then you have 3 and 4, and the Big 12 and the ACC are working together. They're also kind of against each other in certain respects. When you talk about the future of college football, everyone talks about these two power conferences, the SEC and the Big Ten taking over, becoming an AFC, NFC type format, and that just being the future of college football. The reality is the third conference in that is going to be in a way better position than the fourth conference. And I think when you go over the next, let's say, 5 years, as you get to 2030 and a lot of this stuff really starts to kick into form, I think the Big 12 and the ACC have to do everything they can to position themselves as well as they can in the third position, because that's where you're going to be. You're probably not going to catch up to the SEC and the Big Ten, at least over the next little bit, so you're going to have to be able to be running third. The Big 12 is putting a lot of investment to make sure that they are running third in this conference hierarchy, if you want to call it that. So there's a lot of different stuff going into this year. I think this is one that probably won't be talked about too much, out in the open, but behind closed doors, it could be a big time topic of conversation, especially as you get closer to 2030 and some of those ACC deals become a little bit easier to get out of. But all at the end of the day, I think it's going to be really interesting to watch this. If there's any ACC versus Big 12 matchups like there were in the bowl games last year, the ACC is going to want to win those. And obviously it comes down to more than that and more important things than that. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a weirdly important year when it comes down to those matchups and the hierarchy behind the Big Ten and the SEC, with a weird future coming for college football here pretty soon. But those are the major storylines as I see it. Obviously, Florida State bouncing back is going to be a massive one to watch. I think Pitt with Pat Narduzzi, after a very weird year where they started 7-0, finished at 0-6, and had a relatively frustrating year, it's going to be a lot of different things to watch. There's no doubt about that. But let's take our first break, and when we come back, we'll get to those groupings. We'll kind of break this conference down. It's a little bit of a tier, little bit of a grouping type segment, but a lot of different things to get to right after this, so stick with us.